Today, we're installing luxury click vinyl in this bathroom. This is a great, hard-wearing and 100% waterproof floor, which makes it a popular choice. Also, with its simple click system, it's perfect for DIYers, as you don't need an extensive toolkit. Before you begin to fit your vinyl flooring, you'll need to make sure you have the right tools. Hacksaw or circular saw for cutting materials. Spacers to maintain that essential expansion gap. Knocking block and rubber head hammer to safely secure the boards together. Pulling bar to secure the boards in tight spaces. Mitre block for cutting scotia at a 45-degree angle. Multi-tool and chisel to undercut door frames and skirting. Utility knife to cut vinyl planks. Tape measure to get correct measurements. Duct tape to join the sections of underlay together for a secure fit. Pin gun or small-headed hammer and pins to attach the scotia. Luxury vinyl will need time to acclimatise to the room it is being laid in. Acclimatisation is the process of familiarising the floor with its new environment. This is a crucial part of fitting a new floor and will prevent a whole host of problems. It will need to be left for up to 48 hours at room temperature, as vinyl can expand and contract in size. Packs will need to be left unopened and stored flat during this time. You'll also want to prepare the subfloor and remove any door profiles and skirting. Another step when preparing to fit your floor is removing what floor you currently have. In this room, we currently have a good quality, suitable floor, which we will be able to install over, so we can skip this step. Before laying the underlay, you'll also want to clean the floor as much as possible, sweeping and vacuuming to remove any dust or debris.
We're going to be installing our underlay ready to install our luxury click vinyl flooring. We've decided to lay the flooring in this direction to go in line with the bath, so the underlay would lay at a 90-degree angle to the direction of the floor covering.
Now, depending on the type of vinyl you're using, you may or may not need underlay, as some luxury vinyl comes with it already attached. If not, you'll need a separate underlay to reduce noise from foot traffic and help even out any minor irregularities in the subfloor. The most important thing with vinyl is choosing the right underlay. Be sure not to go for a laminate or carpet underlay, as this will be too spongy underfoot and you won't get the best fit. The underlay we'll be using is 1mm thick, though you can go up to 1.8mm if you wish. Before you start, remove any freestanding cabinets, and you can also take off the bath panel to make fitting here easier. When cutting the underlay, it's best to use a straight blade for an easier cut. Whenever you're using a knife, make sure you wear gloves for safety. Also ensure you leave some excess underlay up the wall to cut later, as it's always better to have a little more. Use your hands to smooth it out and check for any unwanted lumps and bumps. Even though you've hoovered the room beforehand, you may have missed something such as grit, and this would show in your finished floor.
When installing our underlay, we want to make sure we tape the joints. It just stops the underlay from coming apart underneath our luxury click vinyl flooring. So make sure your joints are tight. Smoothing it off as we go along. We put our tape across this joint, and on every joint we'll do exactly the same to make sure the underlay is not moving underneath our floor covering. Now we're going to start installing our luxury click vinyl flooring. So we're going to start with our first row going this way, and we're going to measure to work out whether we start with a full board or half board, just so we get a bit more symmetrical in the room. As you can see here, we've got a door frame and we have architraves. We don't want to have to cut around those, so what we're going to do, using our multi-tool here, we're going to undercut the door frames so that when we've installed in the floor, it slides underneath the door frame in your architraves gives you a nice, neat finish. If you haven't got a multi-tool, you could always use a handsaw, or if you haven't got one of those, you can actually cut round it, but then you'd have to use a sealant round the door frame. So to get a nice, neat finish, we're going to undercut this and slide our luxury click vinyl floor underneath. So now we're going to start doing that now. So when using this tool, make sure we use our glasses and earmuffs because it's quite a noisy tool. We've got our luxury click vinyl flooring here that we've placed upside down as a guide to where we need to cut our door frames and architraves. As you can see here, we place it on top, and then when we're cutting, it gives us a guide of where we've got to cut around our door frames and architraves here. Now we've undercut our door frames and architraves, we want to make sure that our luxury click vinyl flooring actually goes underneath what we've cut off. As you can see, it fits in nice neatly there, so you get a nice neat finish. Now we're going to install our first row. Earlier we said we're going to run the boards along this direction. The reason for that was this is our longest distance and it's running along the edge of a bath panel here. Also, we've got our light source from the window, so we try and lay the length of the board towards our light source or along the longest distance. You can lay it the other way, but you'd get shadows across the lines, so you get a lot better looking floor by sending it along the longest distance or towards your light source. So with our boards, we have a groove and we have a tongue on the board. That's how we're going to click the boards together. So we start from right to left with this luxury click vinyl flooring. On our first row here, we want to leave an 8mm gap expansion. So anything that's floating over a floor, so this is a floating system, we always leave an expansion gap. So we're going to have an 8mm expansion gap, and using our spacers, that's how we're going to keep the expansion gap. So we've put our spacers in here. But on our first row here, I need to cut the board because it's too long. So using our knife with a concave blade, you can use a straight blade. The reason I'm using concave, I find it a lot easier to keep control of the knife. So when cutting our boards, there's two ways of cutting it. We can either use a set square, or I'm going to use the edge of another board. So placing it on top, this gives us our straight edge to cut along. Depending on how hard you've scored through your luxury click vinyl flooring is how many times you need to score it ready for breaking open. Nice, easy, neat way of cutting. When cutting our boards, it's really important that you've climatised your product. It needs to be a minimum of 48 hours, just because that will help the product, and it helps when cutting, because obviously if it's cold, come straight in from outside, you'd actually find it really hard to cut and then breaking the boards apart. So when we're installing our first row, as I mentioned earlier, we need to keep an expansion gap of 8mm. So we're going to use our spacers here. That stops the boards from moving when we're installing the rest of the floor. Also want one on the edge to stop the movement in both directions. So now we're ready to cut our next row and clip these boards together. We don't want to just, in this situation here, we don't just want to keep using full boards, because we're not going to get that natural look of a wood looking floor. Although this is a vinyl click flooring, we want to make it look like a wood floor, so we've got the nice grains going across. So we're going to stagger the joints. So I'm going to measure the distance. I'm going to cut that just so we've got more staggering of all the joints. So as we mentioned earlier, we've got our tongue and groove. That's how we're going to clip the two boards together. So at a slight angle here, I'm putting the tongue into the groove and placing that in place. If it's not gone quite in, we use our knocking block and hammer just to make sure we've actually got the two click systems together here. So we'll just keep repeating our process. I'm always working from right to left because that's how we click the boards together. So the tongue goes into the groove here. So on this next board, I could use a tape measure to measure and then put that measurement onto here. The way I do it, I turn the board the opposite direction. So as you can see, I've got two grooves facing each other. And I can just mark where I want to cut here. So as I said earlier, you can use a set square or a piece of the other board. So on this system here, we place the length of the board in, and when it comes to the head of the joint, that's the header, all we do, tap that down, make sure your spacers stay in place. Always keep checking when you're fitting the floor that you've not moved the floor so it's not gone twisted. As you can see here, there's a small gap here, so we've got to make sure we click that board together on both directions. And we repeat that across the room, but when we do our next board, we don't want the joints to be too close. We want to leave at least 300 mil between each joint. The reason for that is stability on the floor and the aesthetics of how it looks. Now we've come to an obstacle in our room here. I'm just going to show you a few different ways how we can mark this, and obviously cutting it to make that luxury click vinyl flooring fit in there. So one way, I can measure the distance and then obviously add on my 8mm for that expansion gap and transfer that onto the board. But the one way I'm going to do it, which might make it easier, I'm going to place an offcut in here, and with my board that I'm going to cut, I'm going to click that into that board now. And now an easy way of doing it is I could use it with my knife now, or I can use a pencil line and then cut it with the knife. I'm going to go straight in with a knife. I'm putting that there, so now I've got my 8mm expansion gap there. And using the tongue of the board, the groove, sorry, that allows that expansion gap. So by placing that board there with the tongue and the groove on the board, it gives me that expansion gap. So here, just going to cut down this side and cut along the length here. So I could either do that the way I've just done or with a tape measure. So carefully prising these apart, depends on how well you've cut through this, how easily this comes apart. And then we take this board off and place the board in. As you can see now, I've still got my expansion gap here. And on every board, make sure we use our knocking block to make sure we've got the click system together. Sometimes you might think you've got it in, but if you've not quite clicked it, over time, those joints can come apart. So I'm going to continue this, and then I'm going to show you how we're going to cut round a pipe on this radiator. So as you can see here, the board, once I place that in position, it's going to be part on the pipe, and obviously the next board will be introduced on this cut. So what I'm going to show you is marking both boards at the same time here. So as you can see here, I'm going to mark the middle of that board, and our next board, I'm going to mark the middle of the pipe, because that's where we want to cut. This is quite an unusual one, because obviously it's not quite in the centre of a board. So normally we'd mark where the centre is, and then we'd do the centre that way, and we'd actually have a section that we're going to drill through. Here, I can do the same on this board, so I know where the centre is, and I place the centre on that one. So I'm going to join those two lines together. So that's what we're going to drill through, but as I said earlier, it's actually going into the other board as well. So I'm going to place both boards together, because when I'm drilling that, I want that section to be cut out on our first row as well. So we need to place this on top of something so we're not drilling through the floor. Here I've got a 19mm drill bit. The reason we've got 15mm pipe, so the reason I'm using 19mm is so I've got a bit of expansion around the pipe. So place that on the middle. So now this first row can go in, making sure we put our spacers in as well to keep that expansion gap. Now we can click those together. You can see how we can go around a pipe, one of our obstacles in a room. To finish that off, we've got two ways. We can put silicone around that, or we can use our pipe roses, which I'll show you later on in the installation how we attach those. We've just got to an obstacle in the room, which is our shower here. We've got this curve, so I'm just going to show you how we mark and cut around this curve. So I've cut the length of my board here. I'm going to place it on top, so it's exactly in line with the one underneath. And using an offcut, we've got our tongue and groove, so that keeps that expansion gap. All I'm going to do is just place some marks on that corner as I go around this curve. So I've got my pencil line here. So all I'm going to do is just join those together carefully. As you can see, I've got that curve. So now I can cut this and hopefully it's going to go in place. One thing I didn't mention earlier is when we're cutting, it's quite useful to put a board underneath the opposite way round. So if I do go past the board, I'm not damaging the floor underneath here. As you can see, I'm actually keeping my thumb on the vinyl here. It just helps me control the knife. And we don't want to have your knife like this. Make sure you keep it flat because you get a lot need to cut. If we start doing this, it starts snagging and it gets a lot harder to cut. Just keeping your flat knife. And before I click it in place, obviously we're just going to loosely place it to check I've cut enough off there. I've actually could do with taking a little bit more off here just so we've got our expansion gap. So here I'm just going to take a tiny bit more off here, just so I know I've cut enough for that expansion gap. And I'll just repeat that process around the shower and a similar sort of process on our toilet and sink here. Right, now we've got to a couple of obstacles in the room. We've got our toilet and the pedestal here. We're going to show you how we're going to template round these so we can cut the boards. Two ways of doing it. We could use paper felt. If you haven't got paper felt, all I'm doing here is using the packaging from our luxury clip vinyl flooring here. So I've taken a bit of the cardboard. And all I'm going to do is cut around the shapes and then I'm going to transfer that onto the boards here. There's a few ways we can do this. All I'm doing here is just cutting around the shape. Another way of doing it is getting our board and we can do little marks on there and then we transfer that onto the board. So I'm just going to cut around here. As you can see now, I'm using my straight blade because it's a lot easier to cut around using a cardboard than it would be with our concave blade. So when I'm cutting it, I'm making sure I leave that expansion gap as well. If you find it's moving, you can always just cut a little triangle out of here and put some tape over that. That would hold your cardboard in place. Same again round here. I'm just going to cut around our pedestal. What I'm doing there, they're called relief cuts. That just allows the cardboard to settle down around the pedestal. So as you can see, by doing that, it allows me to push the cardboard around the pedestal, making it a lot easier for me to cut. If you've already thrown the cardboard away, if you've got an offcut of the underlay, you could always use the underlay as a template. I generally would say paper felt would be easier because it's easier to work with, but obviously if you haven't got that, then this is another option. So when I'm happy with that, we can transfer that onto our luxury clip vinyl flooring here. One thing you do need to make sure is where your joints are going to meet. So if I started that there, my joints would be quite close. So I'm going to stagger this slightly, make sure we're keeping that 300mm gap between the joints, as we mentioned earlier. If I do it the other way that I mentioned, if I had those marks that I did earlier, all I'd be doing is transferring those marks onto the vinyl here. So now I just check, I've got my marks here. Place an old section of your board underneath so we don't damage the flooring when you're cutting through. The advantage of using a board, so a click system here, is if you do miscut this, you could always cut that off and use it somewhere else in the room, compared to if we were using a sheet vinyl. If you miscut on that, obviously that bit of vinyl would have to go away and get a new piece. So that's another advantage of using a luxury click vinyl flooring. What I'm doing here is actually called backcombing. So I'm just getting rid of any of the excess from the backing. Be careful when you're doing this. As you can see, I'm pulling the knife towards myself, but I'm actually moving it away from my body. You've got more control. If I was going away, there's a risk of your knife slipping. And that's how we cut around our two obstacles here. And then I'll do the same on any other obstacles around this section around the back. On our last row here, we've actually got to take a section of the board away. So what we're going to do, there's two ways of doing this. We can use a tape measure. So I'll measure the distance and then take away that 8mm for our expansion gap and transfer that onto the board. The other way I'm going to do it is placing the board on top and using another board, because I mentioned earlier we've got the tongue and groove which keeps that expansion gap for me. I place that on top and I'm going to score through there, and that's one way of cutting for our last row. So, or we can use our pencil if you're not in a comfortable position for cutting, because obviously here I'm not in the best position, and then I can get my body more comfortable for when I'm cutting. So obviously I've got to do it behind here, so I was just showing you there how we'd cut our last row. On your last row, when you're clicking the boards in, it's quite hard to get your fingers in there or the knocking block. So what we're going to use, this is our pulling bar here. So there's two ways of using this. We can either use that end and push it in, but the risk of damaging the wall there. So all we do is place the board, the pulling bar here with that end, and then using our hammer, we can knock the board in place. So that's a way of getting our last row into position if you can't use your hands to clip the board in.
Now you have the majority of your floor fitted, it's time for the finishing touches. You'll also want to install door profiles at this point too.
Now we're just going to show you how we're going to finish off around the bottom of the pipes here. We left a small expansion gap because obviously this is a floating floor, we don't want it to damage the pipes. So there's two ways of doing it. We can put a coloured sealant or a white sealant around the bottom, or we can use our pipe roses here. A nice neat way of finishing off. This is just a silver one, you can get lots of different colours. So all we're going to do here, carefully taking it apart, and then at the back it just clicks in together and it gives you a nice neat finish. So if you don't want to see sealant around the pipe, that's a nice neat way of finishing off. Now we're just going to finish off the floor. So we're going to take out our spaces here that we kept in there to keep our expansion gap. And there's a few ways we could finish off the edge. You could either have new skirting boards, we could use our scotia, but on this situation, because we've got tiles here, we're just going to run white sealant around the perimeter. The trick to sealant is not to put too much on. So I've put my silicone on here. I'm just going to use white, just using my fingertip in the white, just to get a nice neat finish. You can actually buy special tools that help you when you're using silicone. You can put nozzles on the end of your gun, make it a little bit easier. Another way of finishing off the edge is using our scotia, which here they've got a colour match scotia. The reason we didn't use it on this floor was because of the tiles, but we're just going to show you how we're going to mitre two sections that would come in on a corner here. So I've placed a bit of the old flooring, spare bit of the flooring on the floor so we don't damage the floor. So using my mitre block and a hacksaw, we're just going to cut 45. So most corners are going to be 45. Sometimes you might get slightly different angles, so you might have to work on practicing a few little angles, see what works. So I'm going to go for the 45 here. So that would sit in that corner there. And to fix that on, if it was going onto a wood, onto our skirting board, I'd use my pin gun here. So I'd just pin it into the wall. I'd never fix it to the floor. Or we can get some small pins if you haven't got a pin gun, and we could use a hammer and nails to fix that. So now I've got my mark here. I've got to cut my 45 in the other direction to make these join. If you have a chop saw, I'd recommend using a chop saw because you'd get a lot neater cut when doing your 45s, plus you can get a lot of different angles. So now you can see in a corner, we can meet those two together. And sometimes you might, if you can't quite get them together, you could always get a coloured sealant and finish that off neatly. And then all I do here is mark for my external 45s here, and I'd work my way around the perimeter. Now we're going to finish off at the doorway here. We're going to be using a single edge. So this is the side that will sit on the vinyl, and this edge here is what the carpet grips onto when we push the carpet into the door bar. So I'm going to measure the width, cut it, and then we're going to just install the carpet into the door bar to finish it off neatly. So I'm just going to get an accurate measurement here. So to fix the door bar onto the floor here, I'm going to be using some ring shank nails and with my hammer. If you haven't got those, you could always just screw the door bar down. You've just got to be careful they're not too deep or too long, the screws, because you don't know what's underneath the floorboards. You don't want to go into any cables or pipes. So here I'm just putting, we've got the holes that are pre-drilled that we can use to fix the door bar onto the floor. So I'm using ring shanks here. I'm just going to do every other one at the minute just to hold it in place. And now we can tuck that carpet into our door bar. I'm actually going to be using a tucking knife here, but anything that you find comfortable to tuck the carpet into the door bar. And that's how we finish off at the door, gives you a nice neat finish.
Sweep up, vacuum and remove any debris or offcuts and give your new floor a clean. Luxury vinyl will give your bathroom or any space in your home an elegant look, with the benefit of being waterproof and long-lasting too. It may require a small learning curve and some trial and error, but once completed, the final result is most definitely worth it.